Picture this. A British motorcycle just humiliated every American machine on their own strip. It's 1952. Southern California drag strips were American territory. Vate iron, loud mouths, local pride. Nobody invited the British. Nobody wanted them there. But this bike had an engine nobody could explain. A parallel twin pushing numbers that rewrote what small displacement was supposed to mean. In the next 20 minutes, I'll break down exactly how this underdog engineering decision changed motorcycle design for the next 30 years. It is not a Harley-Davidson. It is not an Indian. It is not something built in Ohio or Texas or Milwaukee. It is a machine that was built in a factory in Coventry, England, by men who had never visited California, had never stood on a drag strip, had never smelled the specific combination of rubber and race fuel that hangs in the air at these places. It is a Triumph, and when it launches off that line, when the clutch dumps and the front wheel lifts and that parallel twin engine screams into its power band, the men standing along that fence line feel something they were not expecting to feel. They feel surprise. And then the timer at the end of the strip prints the number, and surprise turns into something else entirely. This is the story of how a motorcycle nobody believed in became the most feared machine on American soil. This is the story of British iron crossing an ocean and doing something that was not supposed to be possible. This is the story of how belief, or the lack of it, met reality at 100 miles an hour on a strip of asphalt in California, and reality won. Let's get into it. Part 1. What America believed. You have to understand what America believed about motorcycles in the late 1940s and early 1950s to understand why the British bike was so easy to dismiss. America had its own motorcycle culture. It was deep, it was proud, and it was built on two names, Harley-Davidson and Indian. These were not just motorcycle brands. They were American institutions. Harley-Davidson had been building motorcycles in Milwaukee since 1903. Indian had been doing the same in Springfield, Massachusetts since 1901. These companies had supplied machines to the American military in 2 world wars. Their engines had carried mail and police officers and working men across the American landscape for half a century. The American motorcycle was a specific kind of machine. It was large, it was heavy, it had a V-twin engine that rumbled at low revolutions and produced enormous torque, the kind of pulling power that suited long, straight American highways, and the kind of riding that Americans actually did, which was mostly covering vast distances at a comfortable pace. The American motorcycle was not designed to rev high. It was not designed to be light. It was not designed to be a sprinting machine. It was designed for endurance, for presence, for the kind of riding where you felt the road beneath you and the engine vibrated through every bone in your body, and you were very clearly on a motorcycle and not pretending to be something else. This was the machine American riders knew. This was the machine American riders respected. And then the British bike started arriving. The first reaction from the American motorcycle community was not hostility. It was something more condescending than that. It was dismissal. Polite, comfortable, completely confident dismissal. What were these things? Small engines, parallel twins instead of proper V-twins, lightweight frames, high-revving, buzzy, foreign, built by people who lived on a small rainy island and had never seen a proper American highway. Who were they to come here and tell Americans anything about motorcycles? This attitude was not unique to motorcycles. It was part of a broader American confidence that defined the post-war era. America had won the war. America had the strongest economy on earth. American products were the best products. The idea that something from England, from bombed-out, rationed, financially exhausted post-war England, could compete with American engineering on American soil was simply not taken seriously. That was the belief. And belief, as anyone who has ever stood at the end of a drag strip knows, does not survive contact with the clock. Part 2. What the British actually built. To understand why the British bikes shocked everyone, you have to understand what they actually were. because the dismissal was based on assumptions, and the assumptions were wrong. The British motorcycle industry in the post-war period was not a collection of small, struggling workshops making primitive machines. It was a sophisticated, competitive, technically advanced manufacturing sector that had spent decades producing motorcycles for some of the most demanding conditions in the world. British roads were narrow. British weather was terrible. British riders needed machines that were agile, responsive, and mechanically reliable, because breaking down on a muddy British country road in February was a very different problem from breaking down on a sunny California highway. The British motorcycle industry had also been forced to innovate by competition, because there were multiple British manufacturers: Triumph, BSA, Norton, AJS, Royal Enfield, Velocette, and others. Competing fiercely for the same domestic market, there was constant pressure to improve. The Isle of Man TT, the most brutal road race in the world, served as an annual public proving ground where engineering excellence was rewarded with victory and engineering failure was exposed in front of the entire world. This environment produced engines of remarkable quality. Specifically, it produced the parallel twin. The parallel twin engine format, 2 cylinders side by side, firing in a coordinated sequence, had been pioneered by Edward Turner at Triumph with the 1937 Speed Twin. Turner's genius was to package 2 cylinders into an engine that was barely heavier than the single-cylinder motors that had dominated before it, while producing dramatically more power. The Speed Twin was a revelation. It was smooth where singles were harsh. It revved freely where V-twins were sluggish at high RPM. It was light enough to put in a nimble chassis, and it produced power at a rate that surprised everyone who experienced it. After the war, Triumph developed this engine further. Displacement grew. Compression ratios increased. The breathing, the intake and exhaust design was refined, and the result, by the early 1950s, was a range of motorcycles that were faster than almost anything available anywhere in the world. The working men who rode these machines to the drag strips in 1951 and 1952 and 1953 knew what they had. They had ridden the bikes. They had felt what happened when the throttle was opened fully. They knew the clock would tell the truth. The rest of America was still operating on the old belief. Part 3. The first time the clock told the truth. Drag racing in America was brand new. The Santa Ana drag strip had opened in 1950. The NHRA, the National Hot Rod Association, was formed in 1951. The whole enterprise of organized, timed, quarter-mile racing was barely a few years old when the British bikes started showing up. In those early days, nobody really knew what would be fast. There were no established champions, no proven formulas, no machines that had accumulated years of strip-proven credibility. Everything was new. Every race was an experiment. And that openness, that complete absence of established hierarchy, was exactly the environment where a surprise could happen. The first time a Triumph won at a major California strip in the early 1950s, the reaction from the crowd was not celebration. It was confusion, a murmur of discomfort. Riders looked at each other, looked at the clock, looked at the Triumph rolling back from the far end of the strip. Something had gone wrong with the timing equipment. The Harley must have had a bad launch. It would not happen again. It happened again, and slowly, race by race, strip by strip, the old belief began to crack. This was not a dramatic, sudden reversal. It was a gradual accumulation of evidence that the dismissal had been wrong, that the confident assumption, American machinery is naturally superior, had no basis in the reality of what happened when the flag dropped. The men who raced the British bikes were patient about this. They were not ideologues trying to make a point about British manufacturing. They were racers who wanted to win, and their bikes were winning. The philosophical implications could be sorted out later. Part 4. Why the Triumph engine was different. At the heart of the British dominance on American drag strips was a very specific mechanical reality. The Triumph parallel twin engine did something that the American V-twins simply could not do. It revved. In drag racing, the ability to maintain power delivery at high engine speeds through the rev range is enormously valuable. When a motorcycle launches off the line, it accelerates through a range of speeds very quickly. A machine that produces its peak power at high RPM and can sustain that power through a wide RPM band will keep accelerating harder than a machine that runs out of power at lower revolutions. The Harley-Davidson V-twin of the early 1950s was a magnificent engine for its intended purpose. It produced huge torque at low RPM. On the highway, pulling away from a stop, cruising at highway speed, the Harley engine was extraordinarily competent. But push it to the high RPM range that a drag strip demanded, and it ran out of breath. The power dropped away. The engine had simply not been designed to operate in that part of the rev range. The Triumph twin lived in that part of the rev range. It was designed to go there. The valves, the porting, the carburation, everything about the engine was optimized for high RPM power delivery. On a drag strip, where you needed that power sustained all the way through the quarter mile, the Triumph was in its natural element. And then there was the weight. The Triumph was light. Significantly, meaningfully, competitively light. The chassis was lean and purposeful. Every unnecessary pound had been designed out of the machine because British motorcycles were developed for nimble road use, not for American highway cruising. In drag racing, weight is the simplest enemy. There is no trickery, no technique, no skill that overcomes the basic physics of having to accelerate more mass. A lighter machine, with equal power, will always accelerate faster. The Triumph's weight advantage over the American machines was not marginal, it was substantial. And at the drag strip, where the entire contest is about acceleration, it was decisive. The combination of high revving power and low weight was not something American engineers had been trying to achieve, because American riders had not been asking for it. The Triumph had those qualities because British conditions demanded them. It was engineering shaped by purpose. And on an American drag strip, that purpose turned out to be perfect. Part 5. The Men Who Made It Happen. The machines did not win by themselves. Behind every Triumph that crossed the finish line ahead of an American competitor was a rider who understood what he was doing, and usually a mechanic, often the same person, who had spent evenings and weekends making the machine as fast as it could possibly be. The American drag racer of the early 1950s was a very specific type of person. He was young. He was working class. He had grown up learning to work with engines because engines were how things moved and things needed to move. And if the engine broke, you fixed it yourself because there was nobody else to fix it and no money to pay anyone else. These men understood machinery at an intimate level, not from books, not from engineering school, but from hours of hands-on experience with engines that had broken and been repaired and broken again and been understood more deeply each time. When these men got their hands on a Triumph engine, they recognized something. They recognized a platform that had been designed with intelligence and precision and that would respond to the right modifications in predictable, powerful ways. The Triumph engine was not a closed system. It was an invitation. They began to modify. Camshafts were the first territory. The stock camshaft profile, which determined when valves opened, how long they stayed open, how far they lifted, was adequate for street riding but not optimized for the specific demands of a drag strip. The tuners found aftermarket camshafts with more aggressive profiles. The power band sharpened. The top-end pull got stronger. Compression went up. Higher compression ratios meant more energy extracted from each combustion cycle. It also meant the engine was more demanding about fuel quality and more prone to detonation if not managed carefully. These tuners learned to manage carefully. They operated on the edge because the edge was where the time slips rewarded you. Carburetors were studied with the intensity of scholars. The Amal carburetors that came on the Triumphs were good units, but they were jetted for a broad range of conditions. The drag strip was one specific condition: wide open throttle, full acceleration, maximum demand. The tuners learned to jet for that one condition and nothing else. They were not building street bikes. They were building quarter-mile machines. The exhaust was reconsidered entirely. Stock exhaust systems were designed to reduce noise, meet legal requirements, and work acceptably across a wide operating range. Drag pipe, open megaphone exhausts did none of those things and instead optimized the exhaust pulse to help the engine breathe better at full power. The sound was extraordinary, loud and sharp and crackling in a way that stock exhaust simply could not match. These men, working in garages and driveways across Southern California, were performing a kind of reverse engineering on the gap between what the Triumph was and what it could be. They were discovering, modification by modification, that the gap was large, that the stock Triumph was already fast, and that the modified Triumph was something else entirely. Part 6. The moment belief broke does not break all at once. It cracks slowly, under repeated pressure, until one day it is simply gone, and nobody can quite remember when it left. For the American motorcycle establishment, the belief that British bikes could not truly compete on American drag strips cracked over a period of several years in the early 1950s. Each race where a Triumph won was another crack. Each time slip where the British machine ran a faster number was another crack. Each conversation where a rider had to explain to a skeptical friend that no, the timing equipment was working fine, the Triumph really did run that. Another crack. By the mid-1950s, the belief was structurally unsound. It was still present in some quarters, still asserted by people who had not been to the strips recently, still repeated by those with an ideological investment in American supremacy. But at the strips themselves, among the men who were actually racing and actually watching the clocks, the belief had been replaced by something more uncomfortable: respect. Grudging, complicated, sometimes resentful respect, but respect. When Triumph released the Tone 120 Bonneville in 1959, named for the Bonneville salt flats where Johnny Allen had taken a Triumph Streamliner to 214 miles per hour in 1956, the respect deepened into something approaching awe. The Bonneville was not a modified machine. It was not a racing special. It was a production motorcycle that you could walk into a Triumph dealer and purchase. And it came from the factory with twin carburetors, high-compression pistons, a tuned exhaust, and an engine that had been specifically developed to deliver performance that previous Triumphs had only achieved with modification. The Bonneville could be purchased on a Friday and raced competitively on a Saturday. With the right rider and minimal preparation, it was immediately dangerous to anything at the strip with proper modification. And the aftermarket was now very well stocked with Triumph-specific parts because demand had been building for years. The Bonneville became something that other competitors genuinely feared seeing in the staging lanes. This was the moment when the argument was over. Not the official end, not a dramatic announcement or a ceremony or a public concession, but the practical reality at strips across California and the Midwest and the South was that the Triumph Bonneville had become the machine everyone was trying to beat. It had become the benchmark. It had become, in the language of drag racing, the one to chase. When you are the one to chase, nobody is dismissing you anymore. Part 7. What happened to the beliefs do not disappear cleanly. They transform. They find new shapes. The belief that British motorcycles could not win in America did not simply vanish when Triumphs started winning. It adapted. It found new arguments. The modified machines argument, the Triumphs that were winning, were heavily modified. You couldn't count those. They weren't stock British motorcycles anymore. This argument had some validity in the early days, and less as time went on. Because the Bonneville came from the factory already fast, and because American machines were being modified too, the comparison was always between the best that each side could bring, and the best that the British side could bring was winning. The luck argument: any machine could have a good day. The American bikes would reassert themselves. They did not reassert themselves, not consistently, not at enough strips on enough days to change the pattern. The pattern was: the Triumphs were fast and getting faster, and the men who rode and tuned them were getting better and more sophisticated with every passing season. The un-American argument, This was the most interesting adaptation of the original belief. If American riders were winning on British bikes, then it was really American ingenuity and American skill that deserved the credit. The machine was just a platform. It was the American tuner, the American rider, who made it win. There was truth in this. The American tuners genuinely were exceptional. The modifications they developed were creative and effective, and pushed the Triumph platform far beyond what the Coventry factory had imagined. Without American mechanical genius, the Triumph would not have been as dominant as it became. But the machine still mattered. The engine still mattered. The lightweight chassis still mattered. American ingenuity applied to a Harley-Davidson produced a different result than American ingenuity applied to a Triumph twin. The platform was not neutral. The British platform was superior for this specific purpose. The Americans had recognized that and chosen it for a reason. The belief, in all its adapted forms, was a response to something that had already happened. It was not a prediction anymore. It was a defense. And defenses in the world of drag racing do not win races. Part 8. The Legacy of the Impossible Win. The wins accumulated. The strips multiplied across the country. The Triumph name became, among serious drag racers, a mark of credibility and performance. BSA followed with machines of its own, the Gold Star, the Lightning, that competed seriously and won regularly. Norton's Dominator, with its legendary featherbed chassis, added another dimension of British engineering to the American strips. The era of British dominance on American drag strips ran from the early 1950s through the 1960s. It was not total dominance. American machines continued to compete and win at various levels, but it was real and sustained and undeniable by anyone who was actually at the strips, paying attention to the time slips. And it produced something beyond the race results. It produced a fusion. American drag racing culture absorbed British motorcycle culture in a way that was permanently transformative. The Triumph and BSA and Norton became American cultural objects. They were ridden by American rebels and American working men and American veterans. They appeared in American films. Marlon Brando in The Wild One, on his Triumph Thunderbird. They were photographed on American streets and American drag strips by American photographers whose images defined what cool looked like in the 1950s. The British motorcycle became American, not because it changed, but because America claimed it. Because America recognized something in these machines, a kind of straightforward mechanical honesty, a performance that did not require you to believe in it before it could deliver, that resonated with the American character. The men who had dismissed the British bikes in 1950 were still around in 1960. Some of them had changed their minds, some had not, but all of them had watched something happen that they had been certain would not happen. They had watched belief break against reality. They had watched a machine from Coventry, England, come to California and prove on a quarter-mile of asphalt that the things you were sure about were not always the things that were true. And in a culture built on speed and competition and the absolute authority of the clock, that lesson meant everything. Nobody believed a British motorcycle could win in America, until it did. And after that, nobody said anything. Because the clock does not care what you believe. The clock just tells the time.